Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here today for our WCC Publishing Series Session 3. And the title of that is Publishing Your Book from Proposal Submission to Publication. My name is Suzanne Lai. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Women's Classical Caucus, and this is part of our Publishing Series initiative to try to reveal and unpack some of the trickier parts of being an academic researcher and scholar. And today I have with me Stefan Vranka, an editor at Oxford University Press, who will speak to us about the process after you submit your book proposal and part or all of your manuscript. What happens next until the book is actually on your bookshelf? So Stefan, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and let's get started. All right, so Stefan, yeah, please introduce yourself, tell us your role, and also, you can start telling us about this topic. So what happens after people submit their book proposal, and what will they submit with their book proposal? That's a question. 2 chapters or a whole manuscript?
Exactly, yeah. Very good. Well, thanks so much for inviting me. And again, I apologize for the technological difficulties here, but there is a lot of material. First of all, I am the acquisitions editor at OUP New York. My brief at the press is classics, ancient history, and archaeology. And these are scholarly and trade publications. So I don't acquire core textbooks, journals, or online products. Although a lot of the content, as we say in the industry, a lot of the content that I do acquire feeds onto our online platforms. So, let's see, I've been doing this for about 15 years. So I've been giving these talks for a number of these years. It's the first one I've given in a while. There is a lot to cover here. I will sort of walk you through the steps from proposal phase to publication, and hopefully I will finish with enough time for you to ask questions. And I think for the purposes of this meeting, I think we will assume that we're talking about a revised dissertation. Most of the people on the call, I believe, are would-be first-time authors. So we'll use that as our sort of scenario throughout this process. But everything I say will apply generally it will apply to any sort of submission, whether this is your second, third, fourth book, whether it's a trade book even. But I will say one caveat before we begin. What the guidelines that I will present today and the sort of procedures can generally be applied to any university press, to any editor at a university press, but within that kind of community, there is a great deal of variety. It all depends on an editor's preferences. Some editors prefer, for instance, to review only a complete manuscript, and others are more flexible in that requirement. So as we continue, just bear that in mind, that what I say today may not strictly apply to my counterpart at Cambridge or Princeton or Harvard. But it should give you a good picture of all the processes that will take place. So having said that, yeah, let's move on. So now the assumption is right now you have communicated with an editor, and you have agreed upon the amount of material for a formal submission, and we'll take it from there. And that conversation, when I have with authors, it will depend. For first-time authors, I would prefer a full manuscript if possible, because the more material I can provide the referees and our editorial board, the more conclusive will be the sort of the assessment of the project. And anything less than a full manuscript, it can be a little risky, because the reviewers may come back saying the project in theory is desirable, it makes a lot of sense, but I would need to see more material to determine if it warrants a contract at this point. But the second scenario for a first-time author, for me, and I often do this, is a partial manuscript, a proposal and a partial manuscript. I would say probably at minimum for a first-time author for a revised dissertation, I would say at minimum 50% of the complete manuscript is what would be required for the review process. Um, and so moving ahead, like we've determined the submission materials that are required for the review, and the next part is the review phase. This is of course critical. Everything sort of hinges on this part of the process. So let me sort of walk you through that. It's going to be a sort of deliberate fashion, and once we get through that, we can maybe break for some questions. So what is a review phase? The reviews, external reviews or peer reviews, as they're called, are sort of the backbone of all scholarly research. For book publishing, it's a blind review. It's not a double blind review. So the reviewers will know your identity, but you won't know the identity of the referees, unless the editor and the referee agreed to out that person to the author. Some referees, usually if they're really enthusiastic about the project and have a lot more advice they'd like to give the author, they may so choose to do so directly, in which case I would unmask them, so to speak, which is a weird metaphor these days, but I would unmask them to the author. So, but generally it's a blind review. And at most university presses, certainly at Oxford, we need at minimum 2 positive reports to move the project forward to our editorial board for approval and for a contract offer. There are some interdisciplinary projects where I may request 3, even 4 reports, but typically it's 2. And the selection, which is, this is the main role of the editor, the selection of the reviewers is really, really important. Obviously, we want a good outcome. We want a fair assessment, and we want, ultimately a positive outcome. With a fair assessment of 2 referees, and usually an editor will ask the author to suggest potential referees. I've been doing this job long enough that I have a stable sort of built of reliable, trustworthy referees that I go to again and again. But I will often ask an author for reviewer suggestions. And this sort of brings me to my first prohibition or don't. If you're asked to provide suggestions, please don't provide anyone who might have a conflict of interest. Of course, this would be like your dissertation advisor, a close friend, or a relative. You'd be surprised what some of the suggestions I've received in my time here at the press. So be sure to provide people who you think would give a fair assessment and would not be sort of conflicted at all in doing so. Now, this doesn't mean you can't suggest people who are aware of your project or have even read parts of it. It's just that they're not close enough to that it would compromise their objectivity. And also, in addition to that, sort of an addendum, if your project is sort of controversial, I mean, there's not a lot of controversy in the fields of classics and archaeology, my fields. There's some every now and then, but if your project could be controversial or considered controversial by certain groups or certain scholars, you might want to suggest to your editor a sort of blacklist or a list of people to avoid assessing the project, who you think would be compromised, you think would be unfair, perhaps even hostile to the project. And if you do that, of course, explain your reasons for that. Don't just send off a list of names of people to avoid. So once the editor has determined the selection of the referees, they'll reach out to them. They'll offer them, a modest honorarium. They'll give them guidelines for the review, and generally for partial manuscripts or full manuscripts, my timeline is usually 2 to 4 months for the reviews to come in. I know some presses take longer than that. I think, frankly, Oxford has the benefit of its backlist of the collection of titles that we're able to offer. We do pay cash often for the honorarium, but oftentimes it's books, and reviewers want our books, so they're usually happy to do it and do it in a timely fashion. So that's usually 2 to 4 months, unless the project is extraordinarily long, in which case it would be longer than that. So all right, and so moving ahead, let me see if there's anything else I missed here. I jotted down some notes.
Stefan, can I ask a quick question? Just,
Yeah, sure.
you're saying, so you said there are 2 review reports. What do you do with those reports? Like, you know, because there seems to be, there are 3 scenarios, right? So what?
Actually, there are 4.
Oh, there are 4.
Yeah,
Okay, can you tell us some of those?
Yeah, I was actually, I came up with a 4th last night when I was thinking about this talk. But first, let me, I will get to that. I will get to that. But let me first say another sort of prohibition or a don't. So I know it's a really anxious time during that you know, those 2 to 4 months when you're waiting for the reviews, but don't pester your editor for information on the reviews unless it's late, unless it's, you know, several weeks beyond the date that the editor has told you when to expect the reviews. You know, we have so much email. We have so many projects that are in various stages of completion that, you know, we don't really want to be pestered by many of our authors about the review updates. So unless, of course, you're running late and it's beyond what the editor has told you for a timeline. So oh yeah, another thing too is I will wait till I get both reviews in. They usually don't, you know, arrive at the same time, but I will wait until I get both reviews in before I share them with the author, because I want to have a full picture of the assessment. It's not fair to the author, you know, if the first review comes like really positive. I'll get into the details of this later or shortly. If the first review is really positive, but the second one is very negative, right? So if I send the first review to the author and say, this is great news, positive review, I think we can move forward. And then when you get a negative review, and then you have to sort of backtrack and reassess the state of the project, which happens a lot. So I think most editors like myself will wait until they have the full review package, whether it's 2 or 3 referee reports, before sharing those with the author. And now to get to your question, Suzanne. So I've sort of mapped out 4 possible scenarios, 4 possible outcomes of the review phase. And the first is, and I'll start with the negative, and we'll work our way to the more positive one. The first one is, you know, both reviewers are negative about the project, and they don't really even provide much hope for a sort of revision and a resubmission of the project. In which case and if you determine as an editor, if you determine that the reviews are fair and thorough, then there's really no choice for you but to reject the project. And I will usually try to suggest other presses for the project, but we'll, you know, there's nothing really we can do at that point to salvage it, at least at Oxford. And so at that point, you don't want to argue with your editor if you get such bad news. And look, this happens, you know, it will probably happen once in your career. But don't argue with the editor. Don't say the reviews are unfair, or, you know, the editor has made, you know, a choice about the project, and you should just, you know, try to accept it as best as you can. And you don't want to burn any bridges, also, because you could work with that editor in the future on another project. So the editor is, you know, is the messenger, has to be the messenger of, unfortunately, bad news sometimes. So that's one scenario. That's the worst scenario. The second scenario would be a sort of mixed review, where one is positive and one is negative. And at that point, it's usually, I mean, what I usually do at that point is have a discussion with the delegate, and I should explain what the delegates are. So for each university press, we have a series of discipline experts who basically approve our acquisitions, all of our signings as editors. And at Oxford, we have a delegate for classics, and we have a delegate for archaeology. So I deal with those two experts, and they're faculty based in North America, and I deal with them on a routine basis. And if I get mixed reports, and I see that there's hope for this project, I may have a discussion with the delegate on what to do, whether or not we should ask the author to revise and resubmit, or if we should solicit a third sort of tie-breaking review. Both scenarios happen quite frequently in my experience. And so if I decide for a third and tie-breaking review, I'll first share the reviews with the author, just to let them know where we are. And I would ask for a brief response to the reviews if they feel that the criticisms are fair and constructive, and then they could certainly revise the project. But to tell them that you don't need to revise it now. I'm going to find a third referee and see if this is strong enough to warrant me bringing this to the editorial board, because I need a second positive review, right? So that's the second outcome. The third outcome is a complete revise and resubmit. There's no real question. Let's say the reviews are maybe mixed, or maybe both negative, but they see potential in the project, and they've sort of outlined a path forward with a lot of suggestions for improvement. In which case, and if I like the project, if I don't like the project, or I don't really have a lot of faith in it, I may reject it at that point. But usually I will ask for them to revise and resubmit the project to me. I will actually first ask them to draft a response to the reviews, and just to make sure that I have confidence in their ability to revise it in light of the reports. And then I will I'll pledge to have the second the revised manuscript reviewed again, and I may go back to to the original referees for a second assessment, or I may find just a fresh pair of referees. That's something that I would have to decide on, and then finally, say the best for last, the most positive outcome, where they both love the project, or they both recommend a contract for it. Then it's me simply sharing the reviews with the author, and then asking them for a formal response. And this is an important document in the approval process. So you would, even if the reviews are overwhelmingly positive, I still would ask you to write up a brief acknowledgement of the reviews. But typically, reviews will contain a lot of suggestions for improvement, some criticisms, and I would ask you to address those in your response. You don't need to address every single item. Sometimes reviewers will comment about typographical errors, or missing pieces in the bibliography, in which case you don't really need to address each and every one of those, but you do need to address the significant criticisms that are in the report. You don't have to accept every suggestion for improvement. You can push back, but and here's another prohibition: don't be combative in your review. I would show a willingness to revise the manuscript, to engage, in the reports, in your response. But again, you don't need to kind of accept every sort of suggestion and criticism even in the reports. So, but if you do push back, explain your reasons and rationale for that. And so once I have your response, I will share that with the delegate, the appropriate delegate. And once I have their approval, I can prepare all the material for our editorial board. So our editorial board is an internal board based at OUP New York. They're all done virtually now. And the board is comprised of the publisher, the heads of marketing, publicity, sales, sometimes production, and my other colleagues in editorial. And we meet almost every week, and we sort of discuss sometimes very briefly, projects like this. And it's not really at this point, the project's been approved by the delegates. So no one really is going to be talking about the scholarly merits of the project. It's more about profiling and any other kind of extraneous issues, any legal issues, for instance. It's very rare, but sometimes there's something that could come up which would maybe expose us to a libel suit or something, in which case we would discuss that issue at the board. Production issues might come up if it's a really large book, if it has a really complicated art program, that could come up. But it's usually about, how do we price this? What would be our general print run? And things about, what should we offer? Should we offer the author in advance? Things of that nature. And so when that is done, when that discussion is done, the board meeting is over, I will usually write the author right away, right after the meeting, let them know that their, a project has been approved by the press. Congratulations. It's a big milestone. And the approval means that we can move on to the contract phase. But before I talk about that, maybe Suzanne, we should open it up for questions, since the review phase is so critical to everything that happens. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. We already have some questions about the timeline and some of these scenarios that you're talking about. So, for example, in the mixed review or the revise and resubmit, like how long do you have to revise and resubmit?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, my sense is I'm happy to work with the author, unless this is a really time sensitive topic, and usually it's not when we're dealing with ancient history. But there could be other reasons that it's time sensitive, like there's a competing book that's coming out, and you don't really want to get scooped by that. So the editor might urge you to quickly revise and resubmit. But generally, most editors working with a first-time author are happy to accommodate their schedule. There's a bit of psychology at play here, because if you give someone an enormously long timeline, a long leash, then they may never finish, right? It's sort of the psychology of these things. But if you do give them a deadline, then they have something in their mind, in their calendar to shoot for. And if it becomes impossible, then you can work with an extension with your editor. Yes. So
there's no like statute of limitation on the the approval.
No, because I think the whole review process, or the internal process, sort of guards against the project from being obsolete, right? Because if you wait so long, you don't update it, you don't update the bibliography, we're not going to be able to publish it, right? So it's sort of incumbent upon the author to sort of work within their timeline and constantly update it, and then finish it and publish it.
Right. And so how long so you were just talking about the report that the author gives back, the response of the reviewers. How long do people generally take for that, or should they?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I'd say a couple of weeks, depending on how detailed the reviews are, how challenging the reviews are. I mean, oftentimes you do get differing opinions, even on two positive reports, where you sort of have to reconcile the two. And the editor should give you some guidance that, that when I read the reports, and if I'm confused by something, I may solicit opinion from the delegate, and we may decide on which report is more valuable than the other, and therefore in their response to the reviews, they should maybe focus on one report over the other. But I would say about 2 weeks.
Okay. And during this time, are you speaking with the author? Like, I know you have an inbox full of emails, but I mean, how much guidance, like one-on-one guidance, do you give during that process? And then like during the revisions, like if somebody needs to revise and everybody's agreed to revise, but the deadline is like a year or 2 years out, like how often do you expect to hear or be?
Um, well, so for the response, one or two emails, it's usually really quick. I mean, again, it sort of depends on the nature of the reports, but if the reports are positive and I'm confident our board will approve it, the response, you don't have to be that overly worried about the response. I mean, you just need to address everything. And I know for first time authors, they tend to overdo it in their response and probably address too many points raised by the referees. But if there are mixed reports and if there's um, if more nuance and more care needs to be made in the response, then yeah, I can be in greater touch with the author about that, which points to emphasize over others. Um, in terms of revising the manuscript, yeah, that's sort of a case by case basis. Um, I think usually I will hear from them as they are nearing the finish line, and they're sort of comparing what they've done with what their original plan was. Because it isn't always the same. Writing, things happen in the writing process, and to make sure that I am fine with that I will accept the current state of the manuscript or the direction that they're going in with the manuscript, even if it slightly deviates from their original plan. So, but it's not a it's not an intensive process because it could be way too time consuming, and I just simply don't have the time for a lot of that.
I see.
Yeah.
And you talked about time constraints, like if somebody's might get scooped on a topic, but what about the
Mm.
time constraints of going up for tenure or promotion?
Very good. Yeah, it's an excellent point. Yeah, I mean, I understand that. I'm very sympathetic to first time authors and this time schedule, and it also affects the submission, the decision of what materials to submit at the beginning, at the proposal stage. If you are running under a short clock, a short timeline, and what you need is a book contract, then there are sort of fast tracks to that. They don't always work. I have to say that sometimes they can backfire. So, for instance, let's say you can't submit a half manuscript, and while maybe you have 2 or 3 chapters and a proposal, I may make an exception to my rule and accept that and send that out for review. But again, what we may get back in return are referees saying, I like the concept, the execution of the project, I'm not so sure. I don't have enough material to say either way if this warrants a contract. And that sort of puts you back at square one. It sort of extends and prolongs your timeline rather than expedites it. But it could expedite it if the reports are positive and we get to board approval and then contract. If what you need for tenure is an acceptance of the manuscript, that's a whole nother issue. And that sort of follows. I will talk about that later in my talk, but I'd say, I mean, to answer your question quickly, there are ways to sort of accommodate a short tenure schedule. If the author, the editor believe in the project, there are shortcuts.
Okay, so what I'm hearing that you're saying is, so
Mm.
you're an internal advocate for the author as well.
Mhm.
So, can you tell us a little bit more? So you have, the reviewers and you have agreed to the project. So there was a step in there that I didn't know
Mm.
about before. So there you go to the delegate next. So the delegate is the first step before the editorial board.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. So
And so the delegate is like a point of one who approves all of the
yeah.
manuscripts.
Yeah, it's quite an enormous role, and my relationship, editor's relationship to their delegate, or they're called syndics at Cambridge. I don't know what they're called, experts at other presses, but that editor delegate relationship is so critical. It's so important, and you have to trust one another, and you have to have a frequent a line of communication. The delegate, the delegates are usually faculty members who have big teaching load, research load, but they do this. They get paid an honorarium, but they do this as sort of service to to the academic community. So yeah, that relationship is vital. And to add another wrinkle, an Oxford wrinkle to that scenario, that process. So we have a board of delegates, U.S. based academics for the New York office. And then there's a board of delegates based in Oxford University, all faculty members there. And they actually have the final say. So once we have approval from our board, we send the packet of our board meeting to another board meeting in Oxford. And so they have the final say, and usually a rubber stamp. It's extraordinarily rare that a project is approved in New York by the New York Board of Delegates, but rejected in Oxford. I can think of one example, which was it was a libel case. Oh no, sorry, it was an obscenity case, potential obscenity case. There was a book about American homosexual art in the 50s and 60s. Major book. I remember this by one of my colleagues here, and I think it won awards. Did really well. We wanted to publish it. And the UK board, because they have different obscenity laws in the UK, and it had photographs from Robert Mapplethorpe in it, and they were afraid of potential lawsuits, so they rejected it. But they allowed us to publish it for our market, and I think we sold rights to another UK publisher. But that is the exception rather than the rule. So yeah, any other
I was just wondering, can a contract ever be withdrawn? Like, so you said like. So there is a deadline. You do give a deadline, right, when the contract is signed. But then what happens because we hear about delays? There was a pandemic, for example. There are other things going on. So, like, how, like, what happens during that approach?
Yeah, let's move on to contracts, and I'll cover that and everything else I have written down here. So, so once the board has approved the project, then probably in 2 to 3 weeks, I'll have a contract drafted for the author to review, and these are for a first-time author. They're very standard contracts. They're not that complicated, but there's a lot of legalese. They're sort of archaic documents, and there's sort of some legalese to sort through. But there are a few things that you should definitely pay attention to when you're reading your contract. One is word count and illustration count. Make sure that it reflects the agreed figure that you and your editor have agreed upon. Editors make mistakes. Whoever drafting the contract can make mistakes. So, and it's really important, because if a contract says 70,000 words, and that's maybe an error, and what you deliver is 120,000 words, then it'll be a problem, because we've sort of created a budget based on 70,000, and it's not a huge problem, but it is a problem. So pay attention to word count, illustration count, if you have illustrations in your book. Delivery date, which you just talked about. Delivery date is a key element of all of our contracts. I would negotiate. It's a negotiable date, right? It's not something you just have to accept that the editor gives you, unless we're talking about a trade book. Trade book is different, because those have commercial interests and risks. So the delivery date is really important, more important for a trade book than for a first-time author of a scholarly monograph. So I would say, think of a realistic date for you to finish, not too far in the future, but not too soon. Editors don't like having to constantly update and push back a delivery date. So try to come up with a real date for you. Also, royalties in advance, usually for first-time authors, and for a lot of scholarly monographs, we don't pay in advance. And advance is against future earnings of the book. So we always will give royalties to our authors, unless it's an open access. Open access is another story, but we always give royalties to our authors. I would say that, and in advance, if you're so lucky, it would just be in advance against these future royalties. So check for those royalty figures. Make sure there's something there. If you're lucky, you might get an advance, but usually not for first-time author. Also, really important to check is that there'll be a permissions clause. So usually our standard contract is to put the responsibility of clearing any permissions, if you have any, textual permissions, art permissions, we put that responsibility on the author. This could be a financial burden, especially art permissions can be expensive. And for some projects, we will share in that burden, financial and administratively. But usually the permissions will be put on the author's responsibility. And then finally, there is an option clause. It's standard in our contracts, and this gives the publisher the right to see the author's next project. We also call it the right of first refusal. So we're the first person, first press to see the author's next project and to make a decision about it. Now, you may not want that restriction. You may have already been recruited by another press to write something for them. In which case you would want the editor to strike that clause, that option clause, or you may want the editor to assess your next project just as a matter of course. So in which case you would leave it in. So those are the key aspects of a contract that you should be focusing on. And I should also say that contract does not guarantee publication. There are conditions in the contract for publication. The manuscript has to be accepted according to our guidelines and according to the editor's judgment, me, before it can be published. So it's a key document for you. It's often a key document for your tenure packet, but it does not guarantee publication. Maybe I'll stop there and see if you have.
Yes, I have questions. And so when you're talking about things like, so then after the author submits their final version, then you look through it completely to make sure that it's like following your style guide, or like, what do you mean by it didn't follow? Like,
I'm plugging in my phone, sorry.
That's okay. It didn't make the correct.
Just in case.
Okay. Like what would cause it not to then be to stop at that point after it's
Yes, good question. So you're anticipating my next section, which, unless we have any more contracts about questions about contracts, I will go on to the next phase.
People can throw it in the chat, but I did cover some of the things that were I collected earlier from the chat, so I think
okay,
we're good to go.
Okay. Okay.
People can keep adding to the chat, and I'll get to those.
Okay, good. All right, so we signed contracts. I had that. We get that process. Eventually, you'll get this is all digitally done, by the way, thanks to the pandemic. It's one positive thing the pandemic has done for book publishing, that we've now gone to digital contracts where everything was paper. Everything was paper, pen and ink signatures. It was so annoying. So this will be all digital, and then eventually you'll get a countersigned copy for your own files. And now we sort of jump ahead. Again, if you have questions about the revising and the completion of the manuscript, reach out to your editor, of course. But let's say you have a finished draft of the complete manuscript. Now, at that point, what I want to establish is the text. The art files I can look at later if there are art files, and the sort of ancillary production forms that we'll need can also wait. So, like abstracts and keywords, that can wait. What I want to do is just to establish the final text and make sure that what we have is in a publishable state. So there are, where is it? Can I write this down? I mean, there are, oh yeah. So, all right. So the first question, and the most important question I have, is, does this need another review? And this is, of course, very important to the author. They will want to know this right away. This really depends on the original submission and the original referee reports. If the original submission was a full manuscript and the reports are largely positive, with a few suggestions here or there, then I don't think that needs another review. That just adds an unnecessary step, in my opinion. But I will not just hand this over to production at that point. I will be checking the manuscript myself looking for anything that's sort of a red flag. If there, if there's something like the bibliography is missing, if the Greek is garbled for some reason, if I feel that the chapter titles are unhelpful, if I feel like the chapter should be grouped into sections, but I'm not going to be reading every word of a revised dissertation. I don't think any editor is going to do that. But I will be checking it, and then I'll also ask you for the art and any other material like maps, figures, tables, and I'll check those to see that they generally meet our requirements. And once that is checked out, once I've maybe sent you a few suggestions, a few changes for the manuscript, I will then also send you all of our guidelines for formatting the manuscript and for submitting the final files. I think I sent you the website earlier, Suzanne, which has a number of links to submitting manuscript files to your OEP editor. And so it's like, we will prefer a PDF of the entire work as sort of a reference that typesetters can check. Go back and say that I will have to. Okay. If it was a partial manuscript that was originally submitted, then I will definitely have to go back for at least one, maybe two reports, and I will go back to the original referees most likely, since they're familiar with the project and they should be able to make pretty quick work of a final review.
Okay, it froze just for a second in what you were just saying. So right before you said that you might send it out to the same reviewers for a final review, you were saying that that link, which I'll share after, I'll look for that and share after. So the author does not submit it fully formatted according to those guidelines yet, or is it just
not for? See, this is where I think there's probably a great amount of variance among acquisitions editors. My own, so I prefer not to, because I think you're wasting your time until I've sort of accepted the substance of the manuscript, so to speak, and then everything else is sort of, I mean, it's important, but it's sort of window dressing. It doesn't need, you're not changing around chapters or the organization of the book. You're not changing argumentation. I want to establish that first, that we have a publishable manuscript. It only needs a few tweaks here and there. But I want to establish that. So I don't think it's worth an author's time to do all the formatting and everything else, especially if I'm going to send it out for review.
That makes a lot of sense. So you're separating the content from the style, the last style thing. Okay.
Yeah.
So there will be a period of time that you give for the author to then apply the style. And how long is that period?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm happy to work with the author. I don't want it to take too long. I want to get this, moving quickly. And usually the author is more motivated than anyone to get this moving into production. So it sort of really depends on how much advice I'm giving the author. But if it was a full manuscript and positive reports originally, hopefully, depending on their teaching load, 6 weeks, to get everything in. But I also want to say that even if you may have submitted a full manuscript originally, and the reports were good enough for me to get it through the board and approval and contract, but the reports may have still, highlighted a number of significant problems with the project. At that point, I may decide that it needs one final review before publication. So even if you submitted a full manuscript at the beginning and you got through and got a contract, at least in my opinion, you may need another review before I move the project into production. So.
And does that have the same 2 to 4 month window?
Hopefully not, because I would likely go back to the original referees. And again, they're usually familiar with this, unless they're super busy with something else. they could do it in maybe less than 2 months. 2 months probably. Yeah.
Okay, and at this stage, does anybody ever hire an editor? Like, I should have asked this actually even before the final submission, because um I've heard and there have been these talks about different types of editors, like developmental editors,
Yeah.
proofing editors, or things like that. So where does that role fit in, and when would you advise? Do you ever advise somebody to get one?
I have for first-time authors. I mean, unless they're, maybe English is not their first language, and maybe they're not as comfortable writing a scholarly monograph in English. At which case, I would certainly urge that person to consult a proofreader or even a copy editor if they can. Professional, ideally a professional, but it could be one of their colleagues who is more proficient in English before submitting that material to an editor. This is really at the beginning stage, right? So developmental editing, that's a whole nother skill. And that really is called for particularly for like trade books, when and some scholars really benefit from that. Also translators, but that's a whole nother project. So for instance, maybe you've commissioned a scholar who's never done a trade book before, commission them to write a new history of Byzantium. And they're very good at writing scholarly monographs and argumentation, but what you need is a narrative history and something that's accessible and engaging to the general public. If this person proves to be not very proficient in writing that sort of style, but you sort of believe in the project, and there's money, and the author maybe, because it's not something that the press usually will spend money on, it's quite expensive, you can encourage the author to hire a developmental editor to work with the author, and that's like shaping the manuscript. There's that's a lot of work. It's almost like it's akin to ghostwriting almost, but I don't think I've actually. I mean, I have hired a developmental editor, but this is for a translation project. It's something completely different.
Okay, so what may be more applicable to first-time authors is a proofreading editor or copy editor, if, for example, they get funds from somewhere to do that. And then, so they have the style, they applied the style, the reviews came back fine. So what happens? So they had 6 weeks to do all that.
Mm-hmm.
What happens next?
Okay, so then
when
they
does
submit
indexing fit in? I've heard of indexing.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So at that point, I pretty much, I will gather materials. This will include the final manuscript in Word and PDF, any art files, hopefully a cover image. That's something that you would talk to with your editor. And the production form. So what we call a manuscript submission form. And that basically will explain to the typesetters the style, your preferred style. Oxford has a house style, but we have a great deal of flexibility. So you would note down your citation style, Chicago, Harvard, whatever. Whether or not you want this copy edited for UK or US spelling and punctuation. Do you want footnotes or endnotes? That may be a negotiation with your editor. Most editors prefer endnotes for first-time author. Is there any art? Does the art need to be cropped? Does the art need anything need to be redrawn? Maps, tables, figures. Let's see. Yeah, so that you sort of explain all of that in the manuscript submission form. And then there's also a marketing questionnaire, which is, this is the document that we use to generate jacket copy. We make revisions, of course, but jacket copy, but also copy for online. So it's an important document. And then once I have all of that, and I've accepted it for publication, I will assign an editorial assistant to the project, and they'll gather all these materials for the production team. And the production team, now most publishers, Oxford is no exception by any means, we have a long production queue. So it would likely be about 2 months before you hear from a production manager. Eventually, you'll get assigned to a production manager. And that production manager will reach out to the author with an introduction and a full schedule of the production process. So it's very key to take note of this schedule, because your input will be required, especially during the copy editing stage and the page proofs. So you want to make sure that you're available for those dates. And if you cannot be available, tell your production manager, give them other dates that would make sense for you. So
can I ask a question there?
Yeah.
So when the production manager gets in touch with the author, then they are the ones talking to each other about deadlines, or are you in that mix as well?
No, it's you. But if they miss deadlines and say the author is I mean, frankly, the production manager, they have an incentive to move things along. So if they're if they're encountering, a lot of delays from the author, then they'll loop me into the conversation and ask me, can you intervene here? Can you find out what's going on with the author? Or if they're not hearing from the author, which sometimes happens. But generally, you're in direct contact with the PM.
And what are the turnaround times for because their stages seem to, like, then it's like in the machine, right? So it's like,
yes.
You got to get back to them pretty quickly, but it could be the middle of the term. So what's the timeline in that process usually?
Yeah. So first of all, to map up the whole production schedule, it's about 9 to 10 months from the time it's assigned to a PM to printed books. So the first step, and these are estimates, I have to say, the first step in the first responsibility that an author will have is to check the art proofs. If there is art in the book, they will be sent art proofs, and this is basically, it's just setting the art on the page as it would appear. And the author is responsible for checking things like contrast of the images, cropping. Do they need cropping or any more cropping? And size, and maybe rotation. Do the figures need to be rotated in any way? So that'll be a first responsibility. That's usually, I don't know, about a month after you hear from the production manager, and then most importantly, you get the copy edits. That's probably about 2 months after you get the schedule, depending on how long the book is. And you will have, I think you have 10 days, a week to 10 days to accept, reject the copy edits individually. This is done, in a digital program. It's all, software. So it's pretty fast and pretty simple.
So a copy editor has looked at the manuscript and gives you some feedback, and then the author goes through what the copy editor suggests to accept or reject.
Exactly. Yeah.
So at that point, the author isn't rereading everything, just the notes at the copy editor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So those copy editors are internal to Oxford or to the
Yeah. I mean, we have a team of freelancers based in the US and the UK. But yeah, they will the PM, you won't deal with the copy editor directly. You'll deal with the PM only, with some exceptions. But so you'll just be looking at their notes. I should say, though, that at copy editing stage is sort of the last stage. We don't like it. It's the last stage to make any changes to the text. If say you want to add a citation to the bibliography, you can do so. But it's always a risk to add, to add material, to change text at that point, because you could introduce an error inadvertently. But you can still do that. So, and then you'll send it back to the PM, and eventually, actually, the next thing you'll see is probably a cover design for the book. It's something I usually show. I don't know if every editor does that, but I think as a courtesy, at least, I show the author the cover design, and I welcome their input on it. And then next will be page proofs, which is another really, really important part of the author's responsibility. And this is sort of the last chance to make any changes to the book. And you really cannot be introducing new text or making any significant changes. But you may find things that are erroneous for whatever reason. Perhaps one of the copy edits didn't get incorporated properly. So it might be good to focus on the original copy edit, like check the proofs against the copy edited document that you saw. And it's also a good time to check the art proofs again and how they fit and how they sit with the text. And then the last thing you'll see is the proof of the full jacket design with the flaps and the endorsements on the back. And once that is signed off, then eventually you'll get printed books.
That's cool. When does the indexing happen?
Oh yeah, good. Yeah, very good point. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, so that happens during the page proofs. Yeah, that's so. When you're checking the page proofs, you're also compiling the index. And we always prefer the author to do their own index. Some authors just don't want to do it, and we can hire freelancers to do that. But our opinion is that no one knows the book better than the author, and no one would be a better indexer for it than the author. And
do authors hire professional indexers?
Yeah. And sometimes they'll hire a grad student to do it, which I think is fine. Which is, I think, better than us hiring a professional indexer who are, they're good at indexing, but they may not have a background in classics or archaeology, and so they may miss things or put things erroneously in the index. Some authors, I think it's helpful, they'll submit with the final manuscript a table or a draft of words, just like a running list of index items that they sort of add to and use when they get the page proof, so that the job of indexing at that point is not onerous.
Okay, great, thanks. And one other question that came up, and this may be early in the process. So how do you determine whether a book becomes part of a series? Because you have a lot of series. So is that earlier in the process? And do you decide that, or does the series editor decide that? And if it is in a series, do the editors step in anytime, like anytime during this production process?
No, not in the production process, but it's a very good question. And this is sort of at the proposal stage, so sort of before I began, is when you submit a project to an editor and you have a series in mind, of course, mention it, and say, and that, because at that point, the editor can first make a decision if it's appropriate for the series in their judgment. And if so, then they can discuss it with the series editors and come back to you with a decision. It's much better to start that right at the beginning, right at the proposal stage. There are times, there are exceptions where I've had a project and I've actually accepted it for publication. And actually, I guess what happened was I first got the proposal years ago, and between the proposal and the final submission, I had started a separate series. This in this case was sort of environmental history and pre-modern societies. And then it occurred to me this book would actually be really good for this series, and so I sort of, reverse engineered the process and checked with the editors of that series, and we agreed to put it in. But generally, especially if you have a series in mind, or if the editor has a series in mind, that discussion should take place right at the proposal stage.
And would you suggest that as well to somebody if you know of a series that this might go in? It would come from your end. So would an author ever approach the series editor directly?
Yeah, I think I encourage that. I don't think really editors would ever feel upset or in any way, or slighted in any way if you went to the series editors first. Series editors know, of course, it has a review process and everything else, and they may love the project, but it still may not work out for the editor and the press. But yeah, we definitely encourage authors to speak directly to the series editors. So related to that, so series editors, it sort of depends on the series and on them, on how involved they get with the manuscript, with the writing. Sometimes they get really involved with a lot of advice for the author, and even some advice for the acquisitions editor. But a lot of times they don't. They'll read enough of it, they like it, and they'll confer their approval, for the series. Yeah. I want to say one quick thing though about like series, because it also occurs to me that open access, because open access becomes such an important topic, especially for UK authors, that discussion really should happen also at the proposal stage. If it's a project that you want to publish, that you need to publish, perhaps you have funding that requires you to publish this as open access, then have that discussion with your editor right away. Oxford, like most publishers, we have a system in place for that. Open access is not free for the publisher. There are, we require a fee for this. It's sort of on a scale, but if that happens, because it changes everything. It changes. It certainly changes the contract. Changes how we profile the books. So those discussions need to happen sooner rather than later.
Okay, and that fee is who pays that fee?
Well, it's the author. It's
so the
really
author
responsible.
Can get money
yeah.
Pay it themselves. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, whether we get it directly from the author or from a foundation, it doesn't matter. But it's the author's responsibility to obtain that. Yeah.
Okay, and I have a question about, so once you have a book in hand, it's all printed.
Mm-hmm.
What happens next? How does it get reviewed? How do you promote it?
Mm-hmm.
Where do you promote it?
Yeah, good question. So again, if we assume that this is a first-time author revised dissertation, the marketing and publicity budget is very small, right, for a book like this. So we will, what we're doing now, and this seems to be sort of the industry standard, is we have a list of reviewers, Classical Review, Bryn Mawr, places that for classics, and archaeology that commonly review our books, and we'll send them I think it's a monthly update of books that have released that are available for review, and they'll send back an email requesting X number of copies from that list, and that takes a long time. Obviously, I mean, I think you're probably aware of this, Suzanne, how long it can be for a scholarly journal to review a monograph. I mean, it's often a year at minimum, often 2 years. So, but eventually they do, and that's an important way for us to promote our books. We promote the books, of course, at the major conferences, SCS, beginning with SCS. We'll have them displayed there. We will also have a virtual catalog that will include the book. There's no real advertising. No one really does advertising anymore. It was never, it never made a lot of sense in the past. So it won't be advertised, but they're also, so because we're so keen on our Oxford academic platform, our digital platform, what used to be called Oxford Scholarship Online, it's still, that content is still there. We've found really sophisticated ways of promoting this content to our readers. A lot of the readers are digesting it online only. So we have found sophisticated ways of doing that. Sometimes we'll share a single chapter from a book. Sometimes we will send something to librarians or to our core buyers, direct buyers, to get them interested in the book. Otherwise, the book can be found on our website. Amazon is a great way to promote the book. Yeah, I think that covers it.
Great, thank you very much. We have 5 minutes left in our scheduled time. So I wanted to, first of all ask you, do you have any final words of advice for first-time authors before we close up the formal part of this conversation?
Yeah. By the way, since I was so late, if you want to go 5 minutes over, I don't mind doing that. Final advice, I'd say, I mean, I would be less worried about sort of the, the proper way of doing things. I think your focus really is on your preparing your materials that you show an editor, right? So especially, and this goes back to the proposal, you want to proof this backwards and forwards to make sure whatever materials you're sharing with an editor. So there's no reason, there's nothing in there that gives them pause, that makes them, sort of question the potential of a project. Also, I think throughout the process, when you have a relationship with an editor, just try to be as reasonable as possible. Try to be grateful too for the time that the editor is spending on your project, and know that they have 1,000 other projects to work on. So gratitude, it goes a long way. Just be reasonable, especially during the review phase, because it could be a bumpy, difficult experience for first-time authors. I would also say that, and don't take things personally. Especially if the project is rejected by the author. It's not a comment about you as an individual or even you as a scholar. There's the project, it just doesn't make sense for that editor and that press at that time. It doesn't mean that you could never work with that press or editor later in your career. So don't take things personally. Don't take the reviews personally. Some reviewers can have a sort of stilted, rigid, almost what am I, a condescending style even in their reports. And so try to take a deep breath before you respond to your editor about anything. Yeah, I think that's I think that about does it.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you giving us an insider's look on this, what to us seems like a very opaque process. And there are a lot of bits of advice that I think different people will take what they can as they put their manuscripts together and walk through this process. So, thank you also everybody for being here. The Women's Classical Caucus will continue to bring you informative sessions like this. And now I would like to open things up to questions. So anybody can ask a question, can raise their hand, and I will take questions from the audience. And just so you know, this part will not, I'm recording so I can take notes later, but this part will not be on our website coming up. If anybody has a question, an open question. Maybe not. Oh, can I ask a question about, do you do edited collections?
Yeah, most editors will tell you they don't really sell very well. The library is sort of skeptical on these. Sometimes they think, and sometimes they are, revised journal articles that can appear in book form. So, but we do, and there's some collections and some works that are really, really important and that actually excite me, but we tend to prefer single authored monographs. Okay.
And what about the length of the book? So, well, you mentioned digital versions of books, in which case page numbers may not matter, but when something does also go into print, are publishers moving towards shorter books, and what would be a reasonable or even ideal range?
Yeah, for first-time authors, generally, between 80,000 100,000 words is sort of what we expect. But we don't want to create a Procrustean bed for the author. If the author's project warrants considerably longer treatment, then then we'll accept it that way. Oftentimes, what we do get in our reviews is suggestions to trim the manuscript. There's a lot of repetition. Maybe there's too much. Maybe there's too much quotation from secondary sources. Maybe there's too much engagement with previous scholarly debates. So I'd be careful about padding, right? Some projects seem padded, and I think one of the chief criteria an editor will have for a first-time author looking at their revised dissertation is to determine whether or not this belongs in a book format or journal format. Is this 2 journal articles, maybe 3, or is this a 250-page book? And that's an important question most editors will ask themselves when they see a proposal for revised dissertation.
I see. And does that word count include notes?
Yes. Yeah. Notes and bibliography.
Notes and bibliography.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about the length of chapters? So is there an ideal length, or is it more about balance between the lengths of chapters? What would you say?
Yeah, we prefer to have a sort of balance. You don't want to have like a 20,000 word chapter and then a 3,000 word chapter. But I would say between 8,000 or 7,000 and 12,000 words.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? I'll keep an eye on that. And so for the book cover art, do the authors send you things?
Yeah, I usually will solicit their opinion on the cover. Sometimes I'll suggest something myself, having looked at the manuscript. But yeah, it's an open discussion. Some authors will send you something that's in the editor's mind totally inappropriate or not compelling. So we'll have a discussion about that. But yeah, I usually will solicit their input.
Okay. Oh, and you talked about that part of the contract that is you asked for the option for first look on the next project.
Mm-hmm.
Does that next project have to go, does it have to be, does the author have to submit a proposal again and then a couple chapters of the whole manuscript, or what happens next for after the first book?
Yeah. So things can change. We're a bit more flexible. You have already published with us. You have a track record. So the requirements are not as great as what they were or are for a first-time author. But again, I prefer to start with a proposal first, and then see if I'm interested. Because I'll know at the proposal stage, see if I'm interested. At which case, we can talk about how much is written, how much more material I would need for the review process. But I would not necessarily want or need a complete manuscript to start the reviews.
Okay, thank you for that. And there was a question earlier about, and this is before submitting, one of the trickiest questions for people is when to submit that manuscript. People say, well, I'm 80% there, 90% there. But when should they submit it? Because trying to get to 100% sometimes can push them back by a few years.
Yeah, so this is before a contract, right? Before approval.
Yeah. So I just thought I'd ask you since the question came up.
No, it's a good question. Well, I think if you have the substance of the work, I like to have the introduction available for the reviewers, but a conclusion I don't think is necessary. Conclusion can come later if you're pressed for time. So if you have everything but the conclusion, send it along. But the editor may have already agreed to only half the manuscript. So don't kill yourself to finish it if the editor is only expecting half or 3/4 of the manuscript.
Okay. And one question I had, because I have been to other sessions with other editors who talked about how people are reading these books, and usually it's not cover to cover, right? So
Yeah,
making
that's a good
sure to
point.
have sections, like chapters, sections, subsections, as just to help the reader. But the reviewers are reading it cover to cover. So when they are talking about repetition, wouldn't a little bit more repetition be necessary if
Yeah,
the imagined reader is only taking one chapter or just a part of a chapter? So how do you balance those out?
that's a good question. I mean, I'm still a book person, cover to cover, like the referees. So I don't know. I think for the humanities in general, people are still digesting a lot of books cover to cover. I mean, they may not be closely reading everything like the introduction or conclusion, but uh, I think you can get too carried away thinking about this potential reader who's only looking at chapter 4 and will not have the help of the context maybe provided by chapter 3. I think that just does you a disservice, as an author. I think you should still look at the unit, the primary unit as being the book. Of course, this is the unit. This is how you get tenure, right? Also, and so that tenure committee will probably be reading it cover to cover. And I think you should have them in mind first and foremost in writing the book, and the other people who are researching and they just want to know an interpretation of an inscription that you found somewhere. They can dig throughout the book and find out whatever else they need. They don't have to just stick with that chapter. Right? I think you can get lost in that rabbit hole, so to speak, by thinking about that ideal digital only reader. But where it does play a factor is discoverability. So as we become more and more aware, the editors, title, subtitle, really, really important. The choice of title and subtitle, and really important are the choice of chapter titles, because that's how people are searching for your content.
Okay, that's new. This is great information. So do you have to come up with those up front, or do you get help along the way? How often do you suggest an alternate title or suggest a different title than the author brings to you?
I often suggest new titles to authors. It's funny because I am still pretty old school when it comes to this, but I am more and more conscious of discoverability, and sometimes plain prosaic description is better than something poetic. And I usually go for something poetic initially, but yeah, I will be in communication if I feel like the title subtitle needs work. I will definitely be in communication with the the author early. I don't get that involved in sort of chapter titles. I may here and there. There are actually some pretty helpful guidelines on the website for writing your book that include information on chapter titles. So our guidelines are sort of constructed around the digital reader of our products. So I think you should consult those.
Okay, great, thanks. And I will send those resources that Stefan was referring to all the registrants in the after this event. But I'd like to bring it to a close because I know other people have other things to do, and they don't want to miss anything.